It was the day that did not quite seem to go to plan. Jeremy Corbyn's idea for a maximum wage cap was first dismissed as absurd and idiotic by two of his former economic advisers, then to what he was supposed to have been talking about: immigration.
We're not wedded to free movement to the EU as a point of principle, but I don't want to be misinterpreted, nor do we rule it out.
Confused? If so, you were not alone. Also on News at 10 tonight. Imagine being forced to use a bedpan in front of a total stranger, a shocking account of the realities of modern A&E. A new Brexit warning. The head of the stock exchange says it could cost 200,000 jobs across the country. Trump's key legal officer spends the day denying he has links to the KKK. And Scoop at the Century, the life and times of a legendary war reporter.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Jeremy Corbyn may be inclined to file this under days that could have gone a bit better. First, he was supposed to be setting out a new, tougher approach to immigration. That is certainly what we were told to expect. But when he did interviews this morning, he seemed keen, as one party insider put it, to distance himself from his own speech. And when he came to actually deliver the speech itself, he appeared to have watered down his own message. And then, of course, there was the fact that many headlines ended up being about another proposal altogether, a maximum salary cap, an idea dismissed as absurd and idiotic by two of his former economic advisers. But at least in a world where even the governor of the Bank of England admits capitalism isn't working properly, he can't be accused of ducking radical solutions.
A Labour leader in the unlikely setting of a farm outhouse in Peterborough, getting ready for a big speech, billed as reconnecting him with voters and his MPs who think he's too enthusiastic about the benefits of migration from the rest of the European Union. And these were the words we were told last night he'd say to prove that for him, Brexit does now mean getting greater control of who comes here to work. Labour is not wedded to freedom of movement for EU citizens as a point of principle. And hey presto, he did say that.
We're not wedded to free movement to the EU as a point of principle.
But then he tagged on a couple of lines.
But I don't want to be misinterpreted, nor do we rule it out.
Which left me, and plenty of others, a bit confused.
Do you want complete control over immigration policy?
Well, obviously, outside the European Union there is control, but quite clearly there also has to be a market access in Europe. About half of our trade is with the European Union. That is crucial. What I'm more concerned about is the way in which migrant workers have been grotesquely exploited.
Nor was that the only head-scratching moment. In the morning, he'd said unexpectedly that bosses should earn no more than an unspecified ceiling.
I'm slightly unclear. Do you want an absolute cap on top pay?
You could set a limit on top pay. I think it's probably better to look at the ratio issue, because that indeed would then encourage wage rises lower down and ensure a better sharing of the resources and the profits of any company.
So all of these sudden shifts on pay, on immigration, took some of his MPs from New Year optimism to...
I think it's a pity that we moved in the space of, 18 hours or something, from what I think was quite a clear line to something which was less clear.
I'm a little bit lost, is the truth.
But this critic of Jeremy Corbyn does feel his pain.
I think it's very difficult, though. I think Jeremy Corbyn, to be perfectly honest and to be fair to him, has a very difficult task, because there are Labour heartlands that are very Brexit, and there are metropolitan areas where the Labour Party is strong that feel exactly opposite.
And what does Peterborough think of telling the rich they should earn so much but no more?
I think it's an excellent idea, and sometimes I think we've got to try new innovative ideas to see if they actually work.
In reality, it probably isn't practical.
So there you are. There are some voters and MPs who'd be happy to drive Jeremy Corbyn to 10 Downing Street, but maybe not enough.
And Robert is back from Peterborough. As you seen, Now, look, this was the day, I said politely at the top, it didn't go quite to plan, but this was the day when he was supposed to set up a clear Brexit policy and a clear policy on immigration. What happened?
Well, it's sort of classic Corbyn. One of the strengths that many people would say he has is his so-called authenticity. He says what he believes. Now, he is somebody who firmly believes in the free movement of people across Europe. And he was put under enormous pressure by his colleagues to say something that showed that Labour was moving towards a position where it would support controls on, or more controls on, immigration. But when it came to the crunch, his sort of conscience, or some would say his vanity, kicked in. And he just couldn't say the words. And I think this is, increasingly being seen, even by his supporters, as a bit of a problem. If you lead a political party, at the end of the day, it isn't just about you. It's also about voters, about your MPs and your colleagues. And he probably does have to do a slightly better job of saying what they want him to say and not just what he believes is some sort of God-given truth.
OK, on a broader point,
yeah.
Where do you think this leaves him as party leader? Exactly the same as he was this morning, or in a different position?
Every time there is a mess like this, his authority is undermined. Now, the most striking thing for me today is, although he faced attacks from a couple of economists who he'd been quite close to, nonetheless, actually, among the MPs who don't like him, actually, they were pretty tame in their public criticisms. Why is that? It's because they tried to bundle him out the door and that failed. And now they are giving him as much rope as they think he needs in the hope that he'll hang himself. Now, that is a risky strategy, because if they're right and he does end up hanging himself, he may end up hanging them and the party too.
OK, well, but we will see. Thank you very much for now. Now, despite all the statistics we've heard and will hear in a moment about accident and emergency departments, it is sometimes a human account that really drives home what things are like. Tonight, we have an interview with an A&E consultant from a major hospital who describes the indignity endured by many of his patients, men and women forced to use bedpans in front of strangers as they lie on trolleys in corridors. He said if it had happened to his relatives, he would have been horrified.
The row surrounding our emergency departments isn't going away. Patients don't know whether to expect crisis conditions or a service that's largely coping, in most hospitals at least. But on the front line, the pressure's so relentless, one senior consultant has chosen to speak out.
We have patients pretty much anywhere that you can have a patient in our emergency department.
We've disguised his voice because he fears for his job, but his words speak for themselves.
We've got patients with severe illnesses on chairs receiving drips, antibiotics, medications, patients with cardiac problems who are on chairs because there's no trolley for them to go onto, unable to monitor them.
It's a disturbing picture, backed up by data just released by NHS England. It shows the number of patients over 70 left waiting on trolleys for over 12 hours more than doubled from 34,000 3 years ago to 88,000. In total, over 185,000 patients of all ages were left waiting on a trolley for at least 12 hours. Nearly 1 in 3 of them were over 80, and the experience can be desperate.
Because we're overwhelmed in terms of our staffing numbers, some of them have been incontinent on trolleys because there just wasn't the nursing staff or the medical staff to get to them in time. And they've done so in full view of their relatives, strangers. You just feel awful.
The sun is at the end of the 4-hour waiting times.
Today, the Health Secretary avoided questions about whether the 4-hour waiting time should only apply to urgent cases, after suggesting yesterday that a third of A&E patients didn't need to be there.
I think it's actually farcical coming out with that. Our problem is not the patients who are coming in through to the urgent care centre or with the less urgent conditions. It's completely to do with the lack of capacity for patients that we currently have.
For those stuck, it's degrading at best. In the worst instances, it's downright dangerous.
Well, that consultant's account is one way of telling the story of what is happening in some A&E departments. The other is, of course, bald statistics. Well, today we found out that in the year 2015-16, there were over 20 million visits, believe it or not, to A&E in England alone, up 4.5% on the year before. Nor is it the older generations filling up our A&E posts. Over half of all visits were made by people under 40. 20% of all patients were admitted to hospital. 37%, that's 7.6 million people, were discharged with no need for a follow-up. But doctors say that doesn't mean they were wasted visits at all. Our health editor, Rachel Younger, is here. Rachel, how does this help us make sense of the overall picture we've been discussing this week in A&E?
Well, I think it helps us assess what the priorities should be right now. NHS England has today echoed Jeremy Hunt's assertion that a third of patients shouldn't be in A&E anyway. Now, that is quite a jump from what the statistics actually tell us. I've spoken to a number of doctors today, and they are all adamant that just because 37% of patients are discharged from A&E without any need for further treatment, that doesn't mean they shouldn't have been assessed in the first place. Think of a child with a suspected head injury, for example, and even if you were able to get rid of those 1/3 of patients, give them alternatives, send them to other places, that doesn't mean you are going to stop people, particularly the elderly, having to wait for a very long time on trolleys because they are trying to get into beds not blocked up by people with minor injuries, but with people in them who can't get out of hospital because there isn't the social care. So the 4-hour target is one thing. But I think right now, and remember the toughest weeks lie ahead of us, the really long waits aren't just inconveniencing patients, putting their dignity at risk. It's their lives in some cases that are in danger.
OK, Rachel, thank you very much indeed. Now, the little girl found dying on a track near a playing field on the outskirts of York has been named by police. Katie Ruff was 7 years old. She died on the way to hospital yesterday evening. Police arrested a 15-year-old girl yesterday and she is still in custody. They have appealed for witnesses. After the financial crisis of 2008, there was real concern that some British banks could collapse if something similar happened again. So the Bank of England introduced so-called stress tests to check they were strong enough to survive, not too much debt, for example. But now the man asked by the government to make our banks safer has called into question those very stress tests. Sir John Vickers has told News at 10 they aren't tough enough, frankly, and they don't offer the public enough protection from another collapse.
Believe it or not, it's almost a decade since the run on Northern Rock. The bank collapsed into the arms of the taxpayer, marking the beginning of a financial crisis that triggered a severe recession. Nowadays, our 7 biggest lenders are subjected to an annual health check by the Bank of England. But one of the architects of reforms designed to make the banking system safer told me the stress tests need to be made tougher and more prudent.
The market is flagging up some questions about the quality of the assets that some of these banks now have. And I think these stress tests, which, let's face it, 3 of the 7 banks didn't do brilliantly in even the Bank of England stress tests. I think we need to be more rigorous, more robust, and use a wider set of information.
Just before Christmas, all of Britain's biggest lenders passed the Bank of England's most recent stress test, with the exception of Royal Bank of Scotland, which was forced to improve its capital position. Now, the tests were based on the book value of the bank's assets. But Sir John Vickers says, take a look at the share prices. In some cases, the market value of those assets is much lower. For example, Barclays' market value is 60% of its book value. RBS is 50%. Now, we asked an economist to rerun the Bank of England's stress tests using the market-based values that Vickers proposes, and it threw up a completely different result. Barclays, HSBC and RBS failed.
The man who carried out the analysis says the tests give the impression that banks are more robust than they really are.
The stress tests are part of the Bank of England narrative that the banking system is fixed, and it isn't.
Sir John Vickers wants the Bank of England to improve its stress tests and force all banks to have more capital funding to protect against future losses.
I do not think that British banks are as safe as they should be. I think that regulation to build up those capital buffers can go further, should go further, but it's rather stalled. And I regret that almost 10 years on from Northern Rock and all the rest of it, we have not made much more progress, both globally and here at home.
Tonight, the Bank of England wouldn't comment on the issues Sir John raises, but it believes that the stress tests in their current form are credible. And it's clearly of the view that our banks are robust enough to survive an economic shock at least as severe as the last one we experienced. Joel Hills, News at 10.
Well, one of the banks that has to undergo those stress tests, as we just heard from Joel, is HSBC. However, its boss was talking to MPs today about Brexit and how he might yet move jobs to France, depending on how things go. But it was the head of the stock exchange in the same session who had a much more dramatic prediction. He said more than 200,000 jobs in Britain's financial industries could be lost because of the uncertainty over any Brexit deal. Our economics editor, Narina Hertz, is here. Narine, let's be honest, we've heard these warnings. In fact, we've heard them for years from banks, but the language used in the predictions were pretty stark today, in the round.
There were 3 city grandees in front of the Treasury Select Committee today, and they really didn't mince their words. They warned of 232,000 potential job losses because of Brexit, and also of wider consequences for the entire economy. Here's the chairman of HSBC.
The ecosystem in London is a bit like a Jenga tower. You don't kind of know if you pull one small piece out whether nothing happens or indeed it has a more dramatic impact.
I really like this Jenga analogy because what Douglas Flint is saying, he's saying that there's an entire ecosystem that financial services are serving that's at stake here. This isn't just about bankers' jobs. It's about IT firms. It's about call centres. It's about transportation companies. It's about the barber who's been cutting the hair of bankers in the City of London for decades. Jobs across the country are at risk, although perhaps not quite as many jobs as they warned today, because, of course, they want to pressurise the government into delivering a deal that's good for them. But today, Tom, it was the bankers talking about the cost of Brexit. What I expect is over the next few weeks, as we approach the invoking of Article 50, we are going to see industry after industry speaking out in a similar way, all of them trying to push the Prime Minister to deliver a Brexit deal that works for them.
OK, for now at least, thank you. But let us see. One last bit of financial news. The FTSE 100 closed at yet another record, nearly 7,300, a rise of 37 points, the cheaper pound, once again boosting companies' prospect. It is the 9th straight record close, beating the previous best of 8 back in 1997. Now, it is a long-established tradition in the United States that those appointed by the president to help run the country have to be approved by Congress. And as we know, Donald Trump has made some pretty controversial appointments. And today, his choice for Attorney General, Senator Jeff Sessions, had to supply his views on issues like abortion, waterboarding and banning Muslims, whilst defending himself against accusations of racism and support for the Ku Klux Klan. And security guards, for that matter, had to defend him from anti-Trump protesters inside the hearing.
Senator Sessions is a racist, and you'll only continue racist policies.
This was always going to be incendiary. With civil rights and America's political fracture on vivid display. All of this prompted by a highly conservative senator emerging into the limelight for the first confirmation hearing of the incoming Trump administration.
Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth?
Senator Jeff Sessions is nominated to be the Attorney General. Who would imagine the next head of the Justice Department would need to distance himself in his opening statement from the Ku Klux Klan?
I abhor the Klan and what it represents and its hateful ideology.
Throughout the day, protests have interrupted the proceedings. His harshest critics say that Sessions is a racist and an opponent of equal rights.
KKK, no fascist USA!
All charges the senator is vigorously denying. But what of Trump's call for a ban on Muslims entering the US? Would that even be legal?
Would you support a law that says you can't come to America because you're a Muslim?
No.
On Guantanamo Bay, he expressed a keen desire to keep the prison in business.
It's a safe place to keep prisoners. We've invested a lot of money in that, and I believe it should be utilized.
And of course, being the Attorney General to a president facing multiple allegations of assault will have its own difficulties.
Is grabbing a woman by her genitals without consent, is that sexual assault?
Clearly, it would be.
Amid the circus-like atmosphere of the hearing, African-American leaders are expressing alarm.
You think it's a threat to civil rights?
Absolutely. When you're talking about somebody that has agreed with rolling back the Voting Rights Act, you know, he can say what he wants about his speeches, but you're talking about his voting record and what he did as U.S. Attorney. You can't erase facts.
This is, of course, just the opening skirmish. Tomorrow will be the confirmation hearing for Rex Tillerson, the nominee to be Secretary of State. There are concerns about his close links both to the Russian government and to Vladimir Putin himself. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Well, back here again, and a new year and a new cycling season should be a time for looking forward. Indeed, the head of Team Sky, Sir Dave Brailsford, has been trying to talk about just that today. But there is no getting away from the scandal surrounding his star cyclist, Sir Bradley Wiggins, and the mystery package delivered to his team doctor in 2011 at the end of a big race. Today, Sir Dave did not end that mystery, but he defended Team Sky's integrity and said fans have nothing to be concerned about. But he did criticise the head of the UK anti-doping agency for getting involved in what he said was a confidential inquiry process.
New bikes, a new season, but old controversies still follow in Team Sky's slipstream. The one causing team boss, Sir Dave Brailsford, the biggest headache, a medical package couriered to Sir Bradley Wiggins' doctor in France in 2011. The UK anti-doping agency is investigating, and Brailsford admits he's handled the accompanying furore badly, but at no time has he considered quitting.
Have you, over the last few months, which must have been difficult, have you ever considered your position here?
I've been doing this a long time. I've been doing it 20 years. We've always done it the right way. Picking apart what we've been doing, last season. Why do we win? Why do we, where do we need to improve? And putting it to this season and thinking about how do we go ahead this season, the season after that. And that's what I've been doing. So,
no discussions with anybody about your future?
I've been focused totally on the season coming ahead.
Brailsford told MPs recently that he'd been informed by Wiggins' doctor that the bag contained a simple decongestant. Documents regarding almost everything around its delivery exist, but it appears, crucially, a paper trail for the drug itself does not. Extraordinary, according to the chairman of the investigating body.
The only extraordinary thing in all of this is that the chair of UK anti-doping decides to comment when we've all been asked to be confidential and respect the process. For the chair of that organisation then to comment about that as it's ongoing and live, that's the extraordinary thing, I think. It's unbelievable.
A few days ago in Monaco, I asked Sky's star turn Chris Froome whether Brailsford was still the right man to lead the team. He didn't say no, but wouldn't endorse his embattled boss either.
The key thing for me is that the focus should be on the season performance and looking forward to the season performance, and that's what he should be thinking about, is the performance. He's got to try and win the Tour de France for the 5th time.
So your relationship hasn't changed as a result of what's happened in the past few months?
Our plans and our future and looking towards this year's Tour are as solid as ever.
Brailsford said today he and his team could be trusted, but added that if anybody did cross a line, the rules were in place to ensure they'd get their just punishment. It was not quite the launch to 2017 they wanted, but it was certainly the one they were expecting. Steve Scott, News at 10, Mallorca.
Whether you spend every fourth summer loving or loathing the World Cup finals, the formula of 32 teams fighting it out for the past 5 tournaments seems to have worked pretty well. But the new boss of world football wants to shake things up. He says 48 countries should take part to include more teams from Asia and, by the way, make an extra £500 million for FIFA.
Since Uruguay kicked things off in 1930, the World Cup has, through the decades, become the most watched sporting event. The dream of every country to do this, the aim of FIFA to spread the appeal as far and wide as possible. Half the world watched a game during the 2014 competition. And at a snowbound headquarters in Zurich, a frosty reception for further global expansion, even if the FIFA vote was unanimous.
That 16 more countries, some of which probably would never have dreamt to participate in a World Cup, will have the chance to participate, and many more will have the chance to dream.
In the first major change since 1998, the 2026 World Cup will be expanded from 32 to 48 teams. The number of tournament matches will also rise from 64 to 80, though the eventual winners will still play 7 games. But critics claim it's purely financially driven, with FIFA's revenue set to rise by £500 million to more than £5 billion for just a 4-week event. It's also to drive appeal in places like India and here in China, countries where the fan base is stronger than the national side. So more qualification spots, mainly for Asia and Africa, means that can be rectified. The rise in allocation for Europe will be less dramatic, and the English FA is already questioning the sporting integrity and commercial viability of the changes. One former Scottish international is equally sceptical.
Every top man wants to do the best for his organisation, which usually means making as much money as possible, make them as wealthy as possible, making them as powerful as possible. If a byproduct of that can be good competitions that work well, then so be it. I think UEFA and FIFA have always made decisions financially first and for the good of the game second.
Given FIFA's turbulent last few years, you might think the organisation's grasp on the game was slipping. But this move has tightened their control yet further. Richard Pallow, News at 10.
Every so often we are reminded as journalists of the debt we owe to those who've gone before. Today was one such day with the announcement of the death of Claire Hollingworth. Back in 1939 she got what became known as the scoop of the century, breaking the news of the start of the Second World War. Working for the Daily Telegraph, she witnessed German troops massing on the Polish border. She went on to report from many other war zones, including Vietnam. At the age of 105, she had seen it all and can safely be regarded as one of the founding mothers, you might say, of war reporting.
If successful journalism is about getting to the right place at the right time, Claire Hollingworth cracked it right from the start. In the late summer of 1939, she convinced the Daily Telegraph to take her on as a reporter. 3 days later, she'd borrowed a diplomatic car to sneak across Poland's border with Nazi Germany.
It was a valley, a steep valley I knew quite well. And I looked down and saw scores, if not hundreds of tanks, already lined up, ready to go into Poland.
The scoop on the impending Nazi invasion was the start of a stellar career which moved from one front line to another. She bore witness to the conflicts which defined the second half of the century, from the Holy Land to Vietnam.
She was working very much in a man's world, but Claire never wanted anyone to make any allowances for the fact that she was a woman. And frankly, heaven help any man who tried to give her a helping hand. She was very determined and quite ruthless. And throughout the course of her whole career, she retained this determination to be the top girl.
But there was great compassion in this great career, and it was also there from the start. Hollingworth led an operation to help thousands of people who had run from the Nazi advance to find shelter in the UK. Work her family are still finding out about.
When we were going through her trunks as children, there were paper cuttings in which she was referred to as the Lady Scarlet Pimpernel. You know, she had somehow helped a lot of people across into safety.
Claire Hollingworth dismissed talk of her courage and determination. "I'm not brave, I just enjoy it," she said. Getting to the next story was what mattered to this reporter. Taking plaudits for the last one wasn't her style.
Claire Hollingworth, the legendary Claire Hollingworth, who died today. Finally, as a journalist of Claire's skill would certainly know, how we all write and talk and what we write and talk about is changing all the time. But it turns out trending, as we might call it now in relation to Twitter, has been around for years. 21st century computer analysis of 19th and 20th century local newspapers pinpoints some big and interesting cultural shifts in our national conversation. For example, the birth of what we now think of as the celebrity culture was actually back in the 1890s, when the names of dancers and theatre stars became more commonly reported than those of statesmen and politicians. A change in the way we travel was signalled in 1902, when horsepower was overtaken by references to trains, and mentions of cricket were eclipsed by references to football in the sports pages around 1909, which, coincidence or not, was the year after the retirement of W.G. Grace. All a bit random, I know, but we thought it was interesting. I hope you agree. And that's it for tonight. Join me again tomorrow. I'll be here for now. Good night, and thank you very much indeed for watching.